Development in the International Development Department here at Birmingham. He's Director of the Developmental Leadership Programme, known as the DLP, which is generously funded by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in partnership with La Trobe University. And I'm also delighted to say, for those of you who don't already know, that we have DLP funding now for at least another 3 years, thanks to the work of David and his team. That's a real achievement, something that has been worked on, I believe, for some months now. David is also co-director of the Development Engagement Lab, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in partnership with University College London. Now, much of what David will speak about tonight comes from work carried out as part of one or other of those research programs. But I want to just say a little bit more about David and his work. His work covers a range of themes, from development aid and financing to migration and remittances, from the politics of development and leadership to the structure of public attitudes towards global development. David has carried out field work in a number of countries, including Myanmar, Indonesia, Fiji, Jamaica, the United Kingdom, the United States, France, and Germany. And as if that's not enough, I'm trying to persuade him, funding permitted, to work with me in the next couple of years in Senegal, Guinea, and Gambia. I hope that's not a surprise to his family who are here tonight. I should say a little health warning on the rest of what I'm going to say, that this is a speech that was written for me. I'm struggling with a little bit of it. I'm not sure I understand all of the terms or even believe some of it, but please bear with me. So it says here, David likes to use a range of methods and approaches in his research, using data collected through nationally representative surveys, interviews, focus groups, the Twitter fire hose, I have no idea what that is, participant observation, lab experiments, and network analysis. He says that he's keen to add fMRI scanning and interpretive dance to his repertoire. Over the past 10 years, David has been PI or co-I on over £6.7 million worth of external research income from the ESRC, the British Academy, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the Leverhulme Trust. He's also the International Development Department's impact lead, as well as being responsible for one of the School of Government and Society's impact case studies. The ethos of carrying out research that matters runs through all of his work, collaborating with many development NGOs and several government donor agencies. This is actually David's second period at the university, following his first period as a student. David arrived first in Birmingham in 1996 to study international studies with economics. After getting 97% in his first year in econometrics, he realized that economics wasn't for him, and he switched to international studies with political science. Easily institutionalized and happy in Birmingham, he stayed on to complete both his master's and PhD here. Then, despite ignoring his mother's excellent advice to get his hair cut for his first academic job interview, he managed to get appointed as lecturer at UCL's Department of Political Science in 2005. Easily institutionalized and happy in London, he stayed there for 12 years. David rejoined the University of Birmingham in 2017 as one of the university's new professorial research fellows. David's second academic job interview, that's 100% success rate, and just in case you were wondering. He managed to get the job despite revealing that he wanted to be a weatherman when he was 17. Nobody is perfect. We're especially happy that David's mum, dad, sister Catherine, and wife are joining us today. Welcome to the university. Jennifer, David's wife, is also Professor of Political Behaviour and Head of Department of Political Science at UCL. And we also welcome David and Catherine, Jennifer's daughter, Madeline. So welcome, Madeline. With all of that, I will hand over to David to tell us why leadership matters for development, both here and there. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to all of you for coming today. Hopefully today will be interesting, hopefully it'll be a little bit fun, and hopefully I'll manage to relax. So, leadership for development. What is the development or the for that we are talking about here? Well, there's a number of ways we could answer that. One is to say, well, this is about the social processes of change, economic, political, etc., that happen in low and middle income countries. Another way of answering that is that, and this is the popular sense of what development is, that it's about aid, overseas aid, development assistance. Or the third way of understanding what is going on is that development is something that happens everywhere, universally, regardless of the country, and hopefully it's change for the better. And today I want to ask a very specific initial question about the role of leadership within development, which is the question of what do people want when it comes to leaders? Because it's been shown that leadership matters for development in terms of prosperity, increasing inclusion, reducing inequalities, unfairness, etc. And when we talk about leadership, we're not just talking about heads of state or politicians, we're also talking about backstreets. We're talking about youth organisations. We're talking about within faith institutions, such as churches, and all the things that they do to try and fight injustice, increase inclusion, increase prosperity. And wherever there is organisation, wherever there is vision, inspiration, etc., that's where we see leadership. And leadership is not just about individuals. It's about a collective process of organisation. It's about networks. It's about the contestation and the politics that goes along with that, arguing and collaborating and cooperating. And it's been said that people get the leaders they deserve, but also what are the kinds of leaders that people want? And this matters, for leaders are nothing without followers as well. And this means that we need to ask a set of questions about what people want. And it's not just the fact that these processes of migration, of climate change, that are rendering the old division between a kind of a global north and a global south not relevant anymore, but there's also positive reasons to think of a more universal way of thinking about development, captured here within the Sustainable Development Goals, that make it clear that what happens here is just as important as what happens in quote-unquote developing countries. And does leadership make a difference? Does it matter? Well, I don't know. Have any of you voted yet? Let's see. Okay, this is where it could all go horribly wrong. Or another place where it could go horribly wrong. Okay. All right. So, on the basis of 12 votes, fewer than I was hoping, we're seeing that most people are to the right of the middle here. So people are going for 7, 8, 9, and 10. What happens, though, if I ask a different question, which is, well, would your answer differ if you're referring to a leader in the UK versus a leader in a country in Africa? Again, if people were vote. Okay. So it seems a consensus is emerging that actually people don't see a difference here. That yes, leaders matter, and actually they matter just as much whether we are talking about the United Kingdom, where we are at the moment, or whether we are talking about a country in Africa. And that is pretty much exactly what the great British public thought as well. This survey done a couple of weeks ago asked the same question, and half of the sample got asked that question about the difference that leaders make within the UK, and the other half got asked the question about an African country. An African country, we'll come back to that in a minute. So, the good news is you're pretty much representative of the British public, which is something of a surprise, I have to say. So the British public and you are right in that leadership does matter. This comes from a wonderful paper by Jones and Olkin, where they look at a series of deaths of leaders over time and look at the correlation or the relationship there between then changes in growth. And 57 leaders died of unexpected deaths. So unexpected, ruling out assassinations, for example, because obviously assassinations suggest that something not so good is happening anyway. And just out of interest, heart disease is the most common cause of death within their sample, and cancer and air accidents are also quite common. This is a graph from the paper, and one of the things that it shows is in a few of these countries, it shows the difference at these breaks when leaders die. So, for example, in China, growth was averaging 1.7% under Mao, but then it jumped to 5.9% a year under Deng from 1978. Mozambique, we have, after the death of Michel in Mozambique and Chissano taking over, and all of the reforms that came along with that, including multi-party democracy and peace with the insurgents, also transcendental meditation as well, though I'm not sure that was what was going on, also saw a big change. And it's not just at the national level we see this. So work by Duflo, for example, looking at the leadership at the village level in India. When women are elected, then we see much more engagement by other women within the communities. We also see different public goods invested in more. So, for example, drinking water especially. So leadership matters. And the process behind leadership matters as well. And luckily enough, I've been lucky enough to have been involved with the Developmental Leadership Programme. Some of my colleagues are here today as well. And this was set up by Adrian Lefwich and Steve Hogg some 10, 12 years ago. And they realised the importance of agency, leadership and politics in changing institutions within societies and how important that is to the process of development. And through getting to know Adrian and Steve, I also got to work with a whole series of colleagues. The director, Heather Marquette, Claire McLaughlin, as well as Ed Avenel, Nahir Dasandi, but also Chris Roach, Tate, Gillian, Suda, and Sarah as well. And working with a load of other people involved with that. And a very formative and enjoyable process. And also getting to work with the Australian government, in particular the DFAT governance team as well. Last year, 4 of us, Heather, myself, Claire and Chris, took it upon ourselves to take all the papers that DLP have published over the previous 10 years, so this is over 100 papers, and try to condense them down into a synthesis to see what lessons consistently emerged. And there were 3 things that emerged, consistent elements. The first is that the process of change and developmental leadership always involved individuals with an intrinsic motivation. The second thing that emerged is that they always did this collaboratively. They had to build coalitions, build networks, and work with other people either of shared interests and shared values or actually quite different sets of values. So, for example, one paper looks at the role of a coalition within Fiji defending the constitution. Another one looks at the role of various coalitions that were built to help pass a telecoms law in Myanmar. And then third, and this is where it gets really political, the role of leadership is all about contesting ideas. It's all about challenging narratives within society and offering a new narrative, a new way, a new vision, a new alternative set of institutions. So, for example, the role of education in Sri Lanka, or women's rights within Jordan, how to reframe them. If you don't fancy reading all of those papers, there is the synthesis, which is 32 pages. If you don't fancy reading the 32 pages, there's an 8-page version. If you don't fancy reading the 8-page version, there's a blog. If you don't fancy reading the blog, there is a 3-minute video that's about to hit social media near you. And if you don't want to watch the 3-minute video, I really don't know what to say. The other project I've been involved in is originally called the Aid Attitudes Tracker and covered the past 5 years, and has recently just started a new phase called the Development Engagement Lab. And this is a project where we examine the attitudes, perceptions and engagement with global development issues of the public, of citizens within the UK, within the US, France and Germany over a 5-year period from 2013 to last year, 2018. I looked at a range of different issues there. So, for example, over time, tracking individuals, what is it that makes them change their behaviour? Maybe whether they donate more or whether they support aid overseas. Also, what about the role of corruption stories and anti-corruption messaging, how that affects people and whether they are less likely to oppose aid if you change the way that you talk about corruption and anti-corruption. And also the effect of fundraising appeals on people's emotions, on people's sense that the world is changing and that progress can happen, and showing those traditional fundraising appeals of a dying child. What does that do to people's attitudes? These are all things that we have done. So I've done this along with Jennifer and also Paolo Marini at UCL. And also we partner and collaborate with lots and lots of organisations, NGOs within the 4 countries, and also DFID, AFD in France, etc. And taught us an awful lot about how to present findings and to, I guess, cut to the chase. And also that involved working with YouGov and also the Gates Foundation, and some brilliant people there. So, what did I want to do today? So I wanted to try and bring these 2 projects together and to try and present a little bit of both, or try and think what perceptions of development and what developmental leadership would look like if you brought the 2 together. There in the bottom left are the 4 research questions from the new phase of DLP, which is about to start. And that first one there, about how leadership is understood in different contexts, seemed to provide a nice route in, thinking about perceptions and how people perceive the role of leadership. And then drawing on the approach of the Development Engagement Lab to try and get after this, both in terms of how leadership is perceived within developing countries, but also in traditional donor countries, the rich countries of the West. This is not about charter cities. This is not about a neo-colonial agenda trying to work out what people in the UK think would be the ideal type of leadership in aid recipient countries. Not at all. In fact, this is an exercise in trying to hold up a mirror to us and our society and try to see what the stereotypes, the myths, and what are the heuristics that the public and citizens within the UK have. And we know from other work that levels of knowledge is incredibly low. Nevertheless, people have very strong opinions based on these stereotypes. And from other work, we know that it's strongly racialized and very paternalistic. And whether that is because people don't want to be giving aid or because they actually think they really, really want to be helping. Like the notion of the white saviour complex is not new at all. Dickens wrote about it in Bleak House with Mrs. Jellyby, the idea of the telescopic philanthropist who was trying to set up and help African children, but at the same time ignored the poverty of her family that was immediately close behind her in her own community. So, what about the demand for leadership? What do people want, and does it vary here versus there? Well, there's a literature on leadership. There's a literature on what people want. Some people would argue that it's around competence and ability to get things done. Other people argue it's about interests and people being able to provide something in return for people either voting for them or following them or selecting them. But then also there's the social identity theory of leadership, and that's what I want to speak about today. And it relies on this notion of prototypicality, which, rolls off the tongue, a really nice term. It comes from the work of psychologists such as Eleanor Roche. And what a prototype is that it's the best or most average example of a category. So, for example, if we think about birds here, the robin is a prototypical bird. It has a lot of birdness, right? It can fly, it looks like a bird. It's what we think about when we think about birds. The penguin and the ostrich, or emu, they look similar to me. Not so much, right? Can't fly. They don't have a lot of the qualities that we think about when we think about birds. Now, the theory of leadership that comes out of this is that people tend to follow and prefer and trust and invest in those leaders that look like their group, their in-group. So on a set of characteristics, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's gender, whether it's faith, or whether it's leadership qualities, etc., we tend to gravitate towards those who look like prototypical leaders. So I will follow, if I'm a bird, I will follow a robin or a hummingbird. I may follow a penguin, but I'm certainly not going to follow a cat. That's not going to turn out well for me. And so that's what we're trying to build on with some new data from a couple of surveys in Indonesia and the UK. And this is work I've been doing with Claire McLaughlin and also a group of researchers in Indonesia and CWI. So what do we find? Here are the results. We find that identity matters, that citizens in Indonesia trust and are more likely to believe that those leaders that resemble themselves in important ways, they are more likely to trust them and invest in them. Competence, so whether or not leaders turn out to be successful or failing, actually doesn't trump identity. Identity matters over and above this. The importance of tradition. This comes out really strongly. The results show that people like leaders who are going to protect and not try and go around or overturn tradition. And this is true in Indonesia, but also in the UK. And British citizens don't like leaders that are authoritarian or commanding. They much prefer collaborative, democratic or charismatic leaders. And actually, despite all the thoughts about whether people's attitudes would be different about the appropriate style of leadership in other countries versus one's own country, in this case the UK, that isn't borne out in the results at all. So how do we get there? A brief interlude. My childhood was very peripatetic. By the age of 10, we'd moved to 10 different places. From Brussels in Belgium to Boston in Lincolnshire in 9 years, which I think is a living metaphor for Brexit. Then we moved to Wrexham by the time I was 11 years old, 12 years old, just in time to see Wrexham beat Arsenal 1-0 in the FA Cup. Sorry, Karen. And it was there that I discovered what politics was and why it's important. And that was watching a documentary about the Manic Street Preachers, a new band then, and a punk band, and they literally blew my mind. The literature, the makeup, the words, the quotations that were in their music, from Antonio Gaudi through to Guy Debord. And then from there, it made me come to Birmingham, as Richard said, to study politics. And here, I remember, this is some of you, if you've just joined the university, won't necessarily recognise this building halfway down. That is the old library that's now gone. And it was in that library, I remember sitting there and looking at the book on the reading list that I had to read for whatever class or seminar it was, and then noticing the book next to it was on the same subject, but more stuff on it. And then the one next to it was on the same set, and this was amazing. I now know that's just the Dewey system, but it was incredibly inspiring. And I stayed on to study a PhD. I'm very happy to say Matthew Watson, my supervisor, is here, so thank you for coming. And it was at a time when the East Asian financial crisis was happening. And seeing the developmental consequences of deregulated finance made me do my PhD on essentially finance and the case for re-regulating it. At the end of the PhD, I remember talking to my grandmother, my mum's mum, and it's a conversation I wrote down, so I'd never forget it, but I probably won't. And it went something like this. She asked me what I wanted to do after I finished my PhD, and I wasn't entirely certain at that point what it was going to be, but I said, I think I want to go on and be a lecturer and work at university, at which point she said, oh, what a waste of all that education. So I don't quite know what to do with that. But I did go on to get a job at UCL. A lot of my PhD drew on the work of John Maynard Keynes. Keynes' house was right round the corner from UCL. I walked past it on my first day, which was a really nice thing to see. I met my wife, Jennifer, at UCL, and we worked together on papers that became what is the AAT, and then the Development Engagement Lab. But I think it's fair to say that the best thing that we've produced together is our daughter, Madeline. Also, as well as some awesome students, there's also some awesome colleagues, one of whom sat in the audience here, Nahir Dasandi, along with Alex Braithwaite. We worked on a series of papers that like hairball up there, that's the World Trade System. And we used that and the way that the World Trade System works to show that the causal relationship between poverty and conflict runs from poverty to conflict rather than the other way around. The picture up there is Adrian Lefwich, who is a famous political scientist and the guy who set up the Developmental Leadership Program. I was very happy to get to know him and work a little bit. Sadly, he died in 2013, and that turned out to be an important turning point because Heather Marquette was asked then to take on the Developmental Leadership Program, and ultimately it's what brought me back here to Birmingham. But it's also a pleasure to work with him. The final thing I just want to mention is that one at the bottom there. That shows a migrant decision-making process, and that's work done with Miranda Simon and Cassie Schwartz and Shane Johnson that we published recently. And through a series of simulations, we showed that essentially the more governments make it harder for migrants to try and cross borders, the more that they increase illegal immigration. So hopefully a paper for our time, or at least a series of lessons that policymakers might heed. So, thank you for indulging me in my brief interlude on how I got here. But back to the question then, and this beautiful photo from Indonesia. So, there's lots of different ways of asking what kind of leadership people want and how to answer this question. And they're all valid and they all show different things. We might carry out interviews or focus groups or collect qualitative data and try and get inside people's heads and understandings, though that suffers from some of the problems about being limited. We might want to try and observe and see what kind of leaders get elected or are successful. And essentially people revealing their preferences. But the problem about that is there's lots of other things going on at the same time that confound it. So it might be that the people that get elected come from a very narrow pool of types of people in the first place, so we're not getting a really fair way of understanding what people really want. The third way, and this is what I'm going to talk about today, and it's not the only way, but it's to run a series of experiments and to try and identify the different elements and pull them apart. Again, it suffers from limitations. It can be especially unrealistic within lab settings, or the types of people, respondents that you use might not be representative, for example. They might come from a particular strata, especially if one's to use students from a university. So, which leader would you choose? Okay, that's ridiculous. Let's think of a better one. So, which leader would you choose? Again, pick up your phones, vote. Oh. I need to do something. There you go. Leader A or leader B. just to remind you, leader A on the left-hand side, Nahir. Leader B on the right-hand side, Madeline. It's your choice. I'm sure neither of them will cry if they lose. Ooh. It's actually closer than I thought it would be. Okay. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that that Madeline is the chosen leader. Congratulations. Right. What does this tell us? Well, why? Why were you choosing? Why do you choose one over the other? Okay, in this case, it's a 7-year-old girl, and she's, yes, everybody's choice, I'm sure. But if we think back to that social theory, social identity theory of leadership, then it tells us that we elect the leaders, we choose the leaders which somehow represent our in-group, that look more like us. So think back to the birds. And so what we try to do here within this experiment is we split the survey respondents. So this was done in Tunisia back in December at the end of last year. It was a nationally representative sample, or weighted to be nationally representative. It skewed slightly younger, slightly more educated because it was an online panel. That tends to happen. Nevertheless, it was carried out across 5 different provinces. And so 50% of the people got put into a treatment group where they got to see a prototypical leader, so somebody who looked like them. And then 50% of the people got to see a leader who looked nothing like them. It's a very simple design. It was actually pretty complicated to be able to write the scripting so people got to see the right leaders, but nevertheless, the setup is pretty simple. And what did we find? Before what we find, this is what it looked like. So this is what a respondent would have seen. They'd have seen a profile that described the gender, the age, the faith, maybe the ethnicity, also characteristics about how the type of leadership they were, and the strength of their faith, and also their attitudes towards visioning change, but also protecting traditions. And so, for example, let's just say you're a male Muslim who's middle-aged. You would probably see this, and you would see somebody who looks like you. This would be your prototypical leader. And there was a short statement at the bottom, and then people were asked to say the extent to which they trusted that leader, from 0 to 9, the extent to which they thought that leader was competent of getting things done and capable, 0 to 9, and then also the extent to which they felt that leader would represent their interest, again, 0 to 9. And here's what we found. So the red dots are the prototypical leaders, and the blue dots are the non-prototypical leaders. And we consistently see that people reward the prototypical leaders as much as 1/3 more in terms of the score that they give them across those different characteristics about trust, capability, and interests. But then we presented them with some new information, and we wanted to see whether they updated their beliefs or their attitudes. So, first of all, a subset, again, of those 50% was shown that at the end of the 5 years that this leader had been successful. He or she had done what they said they would do, and that they had not only succeeded, but actually this had had a series of beneficial consequences in terms of literacy levels and access to health. And then 50% of other people were shown that that same leader had failed. So now what we have is we have people who've seen a prototypical leader and have seen that prototypical leader successful, those who have seen it being a failed prototypical leader, and then those that have seen the non-prototypical leader success failure. So we have 2 dimensions going on here. One is identity and one is success failure. And so that gives us 4 different groups. So what do we see then? What are the results? Well, what we see is that actually people do punish failure in the extent to which they downgrade both prototypical and non-prototypical leaders. So there is a consistent downgrading, but that downgrading is not enough to bring the unsuccessful or the failed prototypical leader down below the successful non-prototypical leader. So identity is trumping success or competence here. There are a few differences in subgroups. So women are slightly less likely to favour identity, but still they don't. It's not enough to trump identity. And actually, we see really consistent results across the different regions that we surveyed in. So these same results stand in West Java. But also, East Java, they also stand in Jakarta. So there's not a difference there between kind of a metropolitan elite that are assessing these things differently. So what are the implications of this? Well, there's a number. One is, well, maybe you work with prototypical leaders. Maybe you try and identify those leaders that are progressive but represent all of those characteristics of the in-group. Or maybe it means you don't work with people who look dangerously or threateningly different to the in-group. But there's real problems with that, because actually what you might be doing is you might be helping establish and embed the benefits that are accruing to that in-group. So are there any alternatives to that, to working with the grain? Well, one is to build coalitions that actually have lots of different groups and identities within them. So the classic example here is women's groups choosing a male champion to help get the message through certain stages of a reform process, like within Parliament, for example. Or, alternatively, you can look for what Jack Corbett has called in his book on Pacific leadership, acceptable difference. So there are certain aspects or characteristics of identity that can vary and still be acceptable. So, for example, he identifies elite women that are accepted because they belong to an elite, and therefore they are acceptably different from women that are not seen as part of that elite group. But if we want to do that, then that means we have to be able to understand which aspects of identity are the ones that people differentiate on and the ones that people punish their perceptions of leadership on. So let's go back to our two protagonists. And why is it that you would choose one leader over another? Is it their ethnicity? Is it their gender? Is it their age? Or is it something more prosaic about their character? Endless debating skills is a euphemism for doesn't stop talking, yes. Now, the good news is that people working in marketing do this kind of thing all the time. They're always wondering about the characteristics of different products that we buy and which things matter more. So if you think about cars, is it the miles per gallon? Is it the size of the boot? Is it the speed it goes at? Is it the price? So they try and vary all these things at the same time, and then if they gather enough data, then we can see which things matter in people making their choices. It's a method called conjoint analysis. And so that's what we do here. So there's 6 attributes that we're looking at on the leaders. So their gender, their age, their religious faith, ethnicity, religiosity, so the strength of their faith, and their attitude towards or approach to tradition. And then each one of these attributes has a number of levels that we can randomize. So if we randomize on each one of these attributes, so let's say pick male or female, 50% one or the other, so we have a female, 37 years old, is a Muslim, and so on and so forth, and that creates a profile. And then we create another profile at random. And then we put them against one another. And then we ask people, well, which one would you choose? And there's a number of advantages about this, because you can vary all the things at once. But also, another advantage is that it actually protects against social desirability bias. So people will start to give answers and reveal maybe some of their biases, especially here around ethnicity or maybe religion, that wouldn't appear if you asked them a straight-up question about how do you feel about somebody's religion, for example. So what do we find? So there's a number of things that this graph shows. So this shows the effect of each one of those attributes compared to a baseline category. So for example, that top dot there shows the probability of a profile being chosen that is female, compared to the baseline category in this case, which is male. And because it's to this side, the right of that bar, it means that if the profile is of a female leader, they are less likely to be chosen. So the scale there on the bottom goes from -2.5 up to minus 0.25 up to plus 0.25. If the answer was 1, that means that attribute would mean that the leader was always chosen. And if it's -1, they would never be chosen. So that probability goes from -1 to 1. So anything to this side means it reduces the likelihood of people choosing that leader. So what do we see here? So female leaders are punished within Indonesia. They are less likely to be chosen. That age in the 50s is a sweet spot. Ethnicity, there's quite a lot of noise here, but if you recode it and you look to just see whether the person's ethnicity matches the respondent, then if that matches, then it increases the probability by 12% of that leader being chosen, for example. And the same thing with faith. Faith matters, tradition matters. In terms of personality, when you're asking people about trust, it stands to reason. They quite like the people who are honest and fair. If you ask people about their capability of the leader, then actually they're more likely to choose those that they are to say that they get things done. So that's the set of results from the set of experiments that we did in Indonesia. What about in the UK? How do people in the UK think about leadership here, but also leadership there? And is there a difference between these two? Do people rely on racialized stereotypes and actually feel like what is appropriate overseas is different from what is appropriate in the UK? And this is what we can look at here. Same setup. So 50% of the people got asked about leaders within the UK, and 50% got asked, quote unquote, about an African country. Of course, we know Africa is not a country. So why is this an issue? Well, actually, there's a number of things that experimentalists do about this. One is they can just say an African country. What's the advantage of that? Well, if you ask about Zimbabwe, or if you ask about Uganda, or you ask about Kenya, people have specific responses. And so what you're getting there is actually what people think about Kenya, or what people think about Zimbabwe, and not about a country that is somewhere else apart from the UK. So what we did is, actually they did get to see 1 of 10 countries, and then we pulled the results, and then we've got enough power to be able to talk about it. This survey was run by YouGov, and this is what respondents saw. Again, a set of characteristics about leaders, and they had to choose between them. On the left-hand side, the writing, the font's getting very small, isn't it? On the left-hand side, it's how people think about leaders within the UK, and on the right-hand side, it's about all those pooled African countries and seeing what the differences are. And actually, the results are remarkably consistent. They only vary slightly around statistical significance, but the direction is always the same, and the results tend to be the same. The only difference is around ethnicity. So for leaders in the African countries that people were asked about, then they tended to say that it's much more important that that leader was black. Within the UK, if the leader was black, the profile was less likely to be chosen, and white leaders were preferred by the British public. So that's the only meaningful difference between the two samples. But what we see here in terms of the results of that is a number of consistent things. Female leaders are preferred for African countries, though not in the UK. And age matters. There's a peak around the 40s that seems to be ideal for leadership. So if you're in your 40s, good news. Religious leaders are punished by the British public. They are less likely to choose them, which is, of course, completely different from the Indonesian samples. So That's something that those who are involved in development within development organisations, donors, NGOs, need to take seriously. There is a tendency within, certainly the UK sector, of being quite secular and not taking seriously the role of faith and faith organisations, and it's something that needs to be taken much more seriously. But also people rejected commanding or more authoritarian leaders. There was much more support for those leaders who demonstrated leadership that was more collaborative and was more democratic, as well as being charismatic. And this was true both for the British public's assessment of leadership overseas as well as in the UK. So those stereotypes of the strongman, especially the African strongman, don't seem to particularly hold within the UK public. So what does this all mean then for the future of the work that I'm going to be involved in over the next 5 years, and what lies ahead? Well, these are the questions that we as DLP will be answering. So this is just scratching the surface of that first question, but there's the other 3 questions. How do leaders work, and how do they work collectively? Where do they come from? And also, how can we support these processes of leadership? And then with the Development Engagement Lab, trying to think about how, as we see this series of global shifts, as I said, around migration, climate change, etc., that these old divisions are breaking down. They never particularly made sense anyway, but actually now they're really shown to be out of date, out of touch, and not helping us understand the current moment within the global context. So these are very old narratives that we tend to play back to the public in terms about what development is, how development works, how you should donate to stop a child going hungry or being poor. We need to think of new narratives to replace these myths that are being destroyed. And this is going to take leadership, this is going to take courage, and actually we see the strength of right-wing nationalist populism, but also there's an emerging globalist tendency as well, especially amongst the younger generation. So thinking about the climate strikes, etc., that we're seeing, and the role of young people thinking about their own futures and trying to take control of it. So the future is indeed unwritten, and thank you.
I first have to check the mic is on. No? Okay, so just give me a second while I turn the thing on. Otherwise, it won't stream. Yeah? Okay. Is that on? Can you hear me? Okay, so I'm Mark Webber. I'm head of the School of Government and Society here at the University of Birmingham. It's my job to wrap things up. This is formally called the Vote of Thanks, which sounds a little bit pompous and a little old-fashioned. But it is, after all, an inaugural lecture. An inaugural lecture is the point at which a member of the university is welcomed into the professoriate. It is their time to profess, to summarise their career in some way. But it is striking, this is the second inaugural I've wrapped up in as many months. And both people are young, yourself and Nick Cheeseman, who gave his inaugural recently. So I'm getting older, and as the cliche goes, policemen and women look increasingly younger as you get older. Is it that the new chairs at Birmingham are younger or just more talented? I'd like to think it's the latter. It says something, I think, about the department from which David hails, and I'll say a little bit about that in a second. I don't have the benefit of having my comments written for me. I could say something terribly embarrassing at this point. I won't. David and I met this morning. He was a little worried about some of the stuffiness of the event, but he was pleased to know he didn't have to wear an academic gown. which I had to do for my inaugural at this place. So that's obviously a trend that is on its way out. Terrific suit. You look far better now than you did at 11 o'clock this morning. And terrific lecture to go with the suit and tie. A professorial inaugural lecture evidences one's standing in the field. David talked about leadership, and of course leadership also matters in academia, both formal, people such as Richard, to some degree myself, who occupy formal roles in the university and who are expected to provide leadership, but equally, of course, it applies to those who do terrific scholarship, who lead by example. And I think what you've heard today is a very good example of precisely that. Wonderful, applied, engaged scholarship. A few months ago, David gave me a copy, in fact, of the synthesis report he referred to. I am a political scientist by background, and actually I find this of enormous interest. DLP is not simply or only a body of work which is engaged. It is deeply rooted in a particular theoretical view of the world, and I think that was on display today, backed of course by first-rate field work and a very solid methodology. So what you've heard here today is an engaged, relevant lecture. David has given a very proficient demonstration of the great work that DLP and indeed IDD does. I was reminded as I was listening about a comment of the late Wallace Stegler, the American novelist, his last and best novel, Crossing to Safety, which is about the intellectual journey which academics undertake both in their life and in their career. It is a crossing to safety, but not in the conventional sense, because David was clear that part of academic leadership is challenging shibboleths and the status quo. It is the journey that matters as much as the destination. It is the crossing rather than arriving at a safe place. And that's my link to my last comments, because I realise I'm all that stands before you and the canapes outside. I was tidying my office this morning, and I came across the wonderful 2010 IDD stocktake document. Some of you in the room may remember this one, and I decided not to throw it away. It's still on my desk. And what a transformation the department has undertaken since. So in a mere 9 years, back then IDD had just one chair. Richard had just retired, I think. Paul Jackson had just been promoted. It now has five chairs, 2 Birmingham Fellows. It will soon employ 2 more new positions to take forward a new undergraduate program. It didn't have an undergraduate program at the time. It had GSDRC, but no DLP at the time. I don't think I'm betraying any secrets here. In that year, it attracted 500,000 in research income. Its research income per year now would be counted in the millions, due to the great efforts of people like David, Heather, who I guess is here somewhere, who have done great work in taking forward DLP under Fiona and Paul and others' great leadership in the department. So it's travelled a long way in 9 years and in the right direction. IDD will be introducing, as I said, a new undergraduate program. Unlike 2014, it will be entered into the next ref. It has huge amounts of impact, engagement, terrific publications, and David is emblematic of that ongoing success. And I hope this is his first and only inaugural, and he stays at Birmingham a long time in order to carry that forward. So if you would join me one more time in thanking David for a stimulating inaugural. And I think there are drinks and canopies literally outside the door. So that's your next destination.